Right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to number 12 in our series of CAWASA Wednesday webinars, albeit this afternoon we have it on Thursday because we had a pretty long course yesterday with Operators Without Borders on incident command systems. So this afternoon's number 12 in the series, and it's titled Source Water Protection, and it will be presented by Mrs. Sara Jade Govia, and she is the water sector specialist at the Ministry of Public Utilities in Trinidad and Tobago. She designs policy solutions and strategy for the government in the water, wastewater, and water resources sectors. She has prepared a number of technical papers intended to help the government to determine and implement investment priorities to climate-proof these sectors. In this capacity, Sara Jade also provides expert advice on implementing technical, regulatory, and institutional solutions. Sara Jade began her career in the water sector within the engineering stream and moved to water resources management. Her experience is concentrated on crafting water and environmental strategy and policy, geological and engineering practices through the design of water supply and wastewater systems, groundwater exploration, and environmental hydrology. Sara Jade now applies the technical experience and knowledge in an advisory role with the government. Since 2012, she has been volunteering with the Caribbean Water and Wastewater Association, the CWWA, a regional non-governmental organization which lobbies Caribbean governments and development partners to build capacity in the water and wastewater sectors and waste sectors. She is presently the president-elect of the Executive Council of the CWWA. Sara Jade coordinated the high-level forum for the Caribbean water ministers in October 2019 in St. Kitts, which effected the Declaration of Bastet and instituted a regional water agenda for building climate resilience. She was also a member of the 2018 Young Scientific Program Committee with the Stockholm International Water Institute and coordinated a seminar on green infrastructure during its World Water Week. Sara Jade was also a conference coordinator for the CWWA's annual conference and exhibition in Trinidad and Tobago in October 2016, which focused on water and waste resources, key drivers of sustainable development in the Caribbean. Sara Jade graduated with an MSc in Environmental Technology, specializing in water and the environment from the Imperial College London in the UK, and a BSc in Geology, a major, and Geography minor from the University of the West Indies, Mona campus. She also completed a range of professional courses in water resources management from the Public Utilities Board, Singapore, Columbia University in the United States, and McGill University in Canada. We have much pleasure this afternoon in having Sara Jade Govia as our presenter. And I will now hand over to Sara and ask you all to please cooperate and pay attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ignatius. I hope that everyone can hear me just fine. And thank you to CAWASA for inviting me to present this afternoon on source water protection. And as Ignatius mentioned in my introduction, I immediately, or sort of my first interaction directly with the water utility was on the water resources management side. And moving from water resources management to policy, I got a really good understanding of why source water and how source water protection can really help with the management of water supply in a country. And source water protection is something that is typically practiced in the US. Some of the African countries do it, and Europe. And I know it's not as common in the Caribbean, but there's an even larger case for us to focus on source water protection in the Caribbean because we are small island developing states, most of us. So we have this sort of intricate dynamic between the watershed and everything that we do in the watershed and the water source, and it's even more, the sort of lag time is shorter. So there's an urgent case for us to focus on source water protection. So what I'm going to do today is just give you an overview on what is source water for utility operators and its threats, look at source water protection, best practices, and then of course introduce you to this concept of integrated water resources management, which is known by a lot of names, but the most common and I guess the most sexy is integrated water resources management. So just taking the full supply chain of water, which is what this graphic is showing us, we see that we start immediately with the abstraction of water for utility. And that filters into this whole cycle of treating water, getting that water to customers, and then what the customers do with that water, and then how the utility treats that sort of reuse or wastewater, as we call it. And immediately the source water protection sort of comes into play in the water supply chain when we look at abstraction monitoring and catchment management. So how do we manage source water from the perspective of raw water, and then how do we manage it from the perspective of sewage? And for the utilities that have both responsibilities, this is where it's important. So really we get our source water, most utilities, from surface and ground and springs, and sometimes springs are categorized under groundwater. And then seawater for some of us is also a form of source water. And why I put seawater in there is because we are noticing a trend, particularly for our desalination operators, that is linked to what we do on land is affecting the sea. And this is where the whole concept of the ridge to reef comes in. So we're seeing a lot of algal blooms, high salinity levels that are affecting our desalination plants. And it's all because of the activities that we do on land. So it's important for us to kind of think about that concept when we are referring to source water protection. So some of the threats to the sources of water that we have from the surface level are the direct discharges. So discharges directly into our surface water. So commonly things like sewage, industrial waste are discharges that affect our surface water. And then we have indirect flows into our streams. And these are sometimes known as non-point sources. So they come from farms, whether they be agricultural chemicals, pesticides, fertilizers, and animal waste. Some of us are also affected by landfill leachate that is untreated, that makes its way into our rivers. And then of course the septic tank systems or the on-lot systems. Solid waste is also an important threat to source water that we're noticing, especially in urban environments where people pollute the water courses, and that affects our source water. And then environmental conditions which affect our source water. So most commonly it's deforestation. And then on the groundwater side, in some cases, we have direct discharges. And this is in particular for Trinidad and Tobago. We have had instances where oil and gas has found its way directly into our aquifers. And then infiltration, the process of infiltration, so cemeteries, gas stations, and even saltwater intrusion has posed a threat to our groundwater systems. So we can think of it as a sort of endogenous and exogenous threats to source water. And one of the things that we sort of of course, now have to consider is the effects of climate change on our source water. So that brings droughts and floods, which of course affects the operations of our utility and the ability for us to supply water to our customers. And then how water allocation from private abstractors or abstractors that are not providing a municipal supply of water, how that is affecting our source water. So why protect this source water? I think the first and most common example or case is because it's expensive to treat. So the cost on chemicals, the cost for us to repair intakes, replace parts is very high when our source water is compromised. And then, of course, the whole concept of natural infrastructure. So when we don't protect our surface water, and why I put that under economic is because natural infrastructure, which are forests, for example, without that, we sometimes have to bear high costs. And I think this is most evident when we see flooding across our islands because of sort of deforestation and lack of natural infrastructure to buffer the effects of those. And there's an economic cost to those type of events. Of course, from a public health perspective, protecting or having a contaminated supply of water can bring illness and in some cases death. And then on the environmental side, of course, because water is a limited resource and we must practice efficiency in how we use it. I know that some of us have an abundant supply of water when it comes to quantity of that water, but the quality of the water always comes into question. That is what places pressure on what has traditionally been known as a renewable resource. And then we have to also think about the alternative uses of water. Water is not just used for our daily lives. Of course, that's the most important use, but also there's a recreational, religious, and cultural use, and so many other uses of water that makes the case for why we should protect it. So I think the most important point here is that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So as we always say, the cliche goes, prevention is better than cure. And that's why it's important for us to protect rather than clean up. So what happens? Let's look at some case studies of what happens when source water is not protected. And we'll start with the US. And the most sort of famous example in the US, of course, is Flint. And the case in the US with Flint is as a result of lead contamination. And it's not only as a result of pipes that were used, lead pipes that were used, but also because the source of water was switched from Lake Huron to the Flint River, which had that contamination. We have also seen most recently in Chicago, because of their forest fires, they have found high levels of benzene and naphthalene in their source water because of these forest fires. Europe and Latin America, we have cases of cryptosporidium in Ireland caused by an outbreak due to animal waste in untreated water for those that self-supply. And then, of course, the pollution from mining in Brazil, that's this example. And in the Caribbean, the two most common examples would be the sewage system failure in Barbados. And we have also had a couple of incidences in Trinidad and Tobago where our major source of supply, which is the Caroni River, has been affected by a direct discharge of diesel into the stream, which has ultimately affected the plant. So some of the typical source water protection measures have been constructing wetlands and retention basins. And when we think about source water protection measures, it's everything that we do that's outside of the pumping station. So there are many cases where we set up things like reed beds and other sorts of natural infrastructures to purify water before it gets to our system, or whether it may be a combination of green and gray infrastructure, such as retention basins. And there's a lot of work and research has been happening now on using different types of green infrastructure. So reed beds are one. The latest would be vetiver grass to trap and treat runoff and purify before it gets to our system. Of course, purchasing purchasing land or easements, so protecting that forest space, and zoning is one of the common examples of how source water is protected. Wellhead protection, and again, this goes into the category of zoning. So oftentimes we can restrict certain activities around or near wellhead. Watershed control is another example. So we are controlling the activities that take place in the watershed that is part of our sort of control area for our source water. And then surveillance is very important. It's another part of water protection because it's a system of how we monitor our water resources, and that could include technology, so using a sort of water quality management system, or it could include something as simple as having wardens that monitor our source water and our rivers and our streams and our aquifer systems for potential contaminants. And public education campaigns, which are very important. So supporting good behavior, and this also supports the whole concept of surveillance, where the public also helps to sort of monitor the source waters. And then the most, I guess, effective example is appropriate siting of source waters. So ensuring that before we site a well or an intake, that the space or the source water that we are using is not affected or at significant risk for contamination. So really, this brings in the case of integrated water resources management. And we all know of this basic sort of model of what a watershed is, and it's just the entire land that water flows over. And because of that dynamic, there are so many threats to our water resources. And this picture, I think, sums it up well. We have agricultural threats. We have the threat of industry and manufacturing. We have threats from urban development, stormwater runoff, gray water, sewage. We have commercial activities such as the gas station. And then, of course, we have activities for waste disposal, such as landfill. So there are a lot of risks posed within a watershed, and that can potentially compromise our surface water. But the thing is, utilities cannot regulate all land use activities. Utilities have a very small role to play in many cases. In terms of land use regulation, there's often, in most countries, the governance architecture, a separate regulator for land use. Utilities often support that. They also cannot enforce and monitor pollution, and there's often an environmental regulator that does that. And then they have a certain threshold for treatment technology. So a lot of times it's very expensive to treat all forms of contaminants. So we see here that the utilities, in terms of their institution, in terms of their resources, are very limited in how they can manage at the catchment level to protect watersheds. So how do we counter that, and how do we work together to protect source water? Is it just the responsibility of a utility, or is it everyone's responsibility? And this process of integrated water resources management is really bringing the sort of coordination and integration that is required to bring all stakeholders together. So really, as the Global Water Partnership defined, and Global Water Partnership has really coined this concept of integrated water resources management, they have defined that it's a process of managing and planning water, land, and related resources to maximize the benefit of water while protecting ecosystems and the environment. So there's a basic structure that allows integrated water resources management to enable economic efficiency, social equity, and ecological sustainability. So this is an entire national sort of planning framework for water resources that is out there and is a best practice for countries. And we see that there are three elements. So there's the enabling environment. So what are the instruments that we have in place to support this coordination and integration of resources and people and institutions? And then there are management instruments. So how do we regulate the tools for allocation, what are the tools for managing water resources and bringing these stakeholders together. And then there's, of course, institutional rules. How do we build capacity? What are the systems and enablers of this entire process of integrating and coordinating? So it's very complex. It recognizes that there are interlinkages and intralinkages between stakeholders. And I think this is a good starting point for utilities to begin looking at source water protection and a base for utilities to start to work with their stakeholders. So how do we plan for source water protection, or how do we develop a source water protection plan? And I think, I mean, in many instances, and there are a lot of resources that are out there, particularly at the US EPA level and the AWWA. They have a lot of templates on how to plan for utilities that can help utilities plan source water protection. And the first point is always delineating that physical space that you're referring to as your source water protection area. And of course, that depends on the physical properties of your source water. So in the case of an aquifer, the velocity and flow of that water, and similar to a river. So a source water protection area may expand to a small sort of wellhead area, or it can be as big as a watershed. In many cases, I will say that simple sort of single source intakes or wells often don't need a source water protection plan. It's really most effective when you have multiple sources of water along that particular system. So the second thing that you of course want to do is you want to look at the risks and the susceptibility of your system. So what are the potential points of contaminants? And you create an inventory around that. And you then start to build your management plan based on that. And we'll get in a little bit to that management plan. But the idea really is for you to look at, based on those potential contaminants that you've identified, it's not just identifying contaminants, but also looking, prioritizing or weighting the risk of these contaminants to your source water, and then identifying sort of trends. Is the problem getting better? Is it getting worse across time? Because of course, as development increases in our source water protection area, there's potential risk of certain types of development, whether it be sewage or farming or landfills that could affect our source water. So it's not just tackling every single thing that can affect our source water, but prioritizing what has the highest risk. And then we want to do our management plan. And we develop that based on the first 2 points, based on the source water protection area and based on this inventory we've created. And this management plan includes things like coordinating with other regulators and the actual sources of contaminants, those land owners, and then identifying how do we secure and protect our sources of water from certain activities. How are we going to monitor that, the surveillance that's required, and how are we going to engage the community, whether that be through education or it be through outreach. And of course, we have to have a contingency plan. What happens if all else fails and we're unable to protect our source water? What are the procedures that we have in place when our monitoring system tells us we've had a breach? What do we do? How do we shut down our facilities? And there should be a potential alternate source of water, where if in the event that we may have to shut down our facility. And it's always important, of course, in any plan to monitor that plan and evaluate that plan and make it iterative so that you can update your plan as you move along. So a little bit more on the management side of the source water protection plan. So really what we're trying to do is manage the sources of contamination. And what that looks like is working with the landowners to implement best practices. Now, this may not always be a utility's responsibility. It cannot be a utility's responsibility to work with farmers or construction companies. but there are stakeholders that specialize and their sort of portfolio and their mandates are to work with these groups of people. So educating farmers, having them or sort of raising the red flag and having them educate farmers on things like integrated pest management, crop rotation, animal grazing, and using the agricultural experts and the state agricultural sort of governance structure to work with these farmers. On the quarrying and mining side and even construction, the idea is that we want to control sedimentation, we want to control erosion. So that may look like having on-site vehicle washing, something as simple as timing construction to ensure that we do construction in low rainfall seasons, and then landscaping to avoid that sort of contamination from those sites. And then, of course, an important part of source water protection is how we manage our forests. And forests are very important, and we'll see later on from a cost perspective and some statistics on how forests help utilities to protect their source water. And the idea really is to protect the primary forests, to protect the forests that is along your riparian zone, particularly for surface water, and then planning harvesting periods. So oftentimes a lot of us use our forests. It's not just protected, there's a cycle for us to develop that forest in a sustainable way, but ensuring that we do it so that it doesn't threaten the municipal water supply. Wastewater management is important, and for utilities that have the dual service of providing water and wastewater services, this is a little bit easier. But I know that a lot of our utilities, particularly in the region, the coverage, the centralized wastewater treatment coverage is pretty low. So a lot of us still use septic tank and on-lot systems. So how do we protect our water sources from seepage from sort of overloaded septic tanks? And really that looks like regulation of septic tanks, which often is the responsibility of the utility or maybe the responsibility of the land use regulator. And then stormwater management, and this is an important one that's creeping up on us as we develop our land spaces. So working with developers to find systems, whether it's using gray or green infrastructure to buffer their effect on source water. Looking at restoring stream banks for developments that are close to rivers, ensuring that there's that riparian buffer zone for in the event of contamination, and then things like retention and detention ponds, which are pretty common in larger sort of developments. So this is an example of just a planning framework that came from Uganda that is very useful to show you what the steps in this source water protection planning looks like. And we went in to prepare to the technical issues. So what is your source water protection area? What are you defining that as in terms of your geographic space or physical space? And then what are the risks? And then of course, engaging stakeholders is another key component. As we mentioned before, utilities can't do it all. And then mobilizing the resources that are required, and resources refer here to financing as well as staff. And then implementing that and then having an iterative process. And in this case for Uganda, they recommend an annual review of that plan to see how the monitoring, how the stakeholder engagement and the collaboration is going. So how do we execute after we've done our source water protection plan? How do we execute our plan? And my first advice would be to start small. So you don't try to develop a source water protection plan for every single one of your facilities or your intakes or your well fields. You develop a plan that is scalable. So you may want to look at the regional or district level, and you develop that sort of system that will allow you to probably mimic some of the work and the results that you've achieved in that small area. The second thing is not every contaminant or risk you need to go after. So target the prioritize your risks and target those that are of higher priority. And that may be the risks of contamination that you cannot treat, your system has no threshold to treat, or you decide what that sort of risk management framework is. And then you also, partnerships are very important. As we saw, utilities really can't do everything. And this partnership is across sectors, and it's also within the utility. So the operations team are not the only ones that are responsible for this. All of the utility has a role to play, whether it's your customer service, your communications, or your education, your communications and outreach teams. They also have a stake to play. So it's about partnership within the utility and outside of the utility. Another important point is finding community champions. And I think this is where the reach of the utility can be even wider when they start to engage the community and have champions within the community that can perform that sort of surveillance and advocate for the execution of this source water protection plan. And that only comes in when you begin to engage your community groups. Messaging is very important because it communicates why source water protection is not just the responsibility of a utility, and it gives the buy-in that is required to help you to get these sorts of partnerships and collaborations that you need. And I guess the second to last point is probably the most important point, money talks. How do we fund source water protection? And it really starts with making a business case for source water protection. Why should a utility invest in this, or why should the government invest in source water protection? And that business case often has to go past our regulator. And we'll just get into a little bit on how we do that. And then, of course, funding sources. So how do I, after I've made my business case, how do I fund it? And there are a lot of options for us to do that. And it varies across our countries. There's local funding, so we can structure source water protection in our water rates, or we can go after green or capital development sorts of funds. And then there's external financing, so we can get a loan or a bond sort of arrangement to fund the source water protection, or we can go after grants that can help us to fund source water protection. So what's the business case for source water protection? Why should I make this investment as a shareholder or as the government a shareholder of a utility? Why should I make this investment in source water protection? And beside the obvious that prevention is better than cure, there are lots of studies out there, again, mostly in the US, that show that cleanup on average is 30 to 40 times more, and in some cases 200 times greater than protecting source water. And if we were to put this in dollars and cents, this will be quite alarming to a lot of money, a lot of investors, in terms of why we should look towards protecting before rather than cleanup. A 2016 AWWA study found that converting 10% of the average watershed from forest to developed area increased chemical treatment costs from $252 to $20.48 annually per million gallons treated. And this is also striking and makes the case for the protection of forests. And I think one of the important points that is coming out of source water protection is the role of ecosystem services and value in ecosystem services. So what is the monetary value of these services that forest provides? And utility source water protection is one of the big cases. There's Freeman looked in 2008 at the cost of or the effects from a contaminant perspective of forest cover. And what his team found is there was a 1% increase in forest cover, and that reduces turbidity by 0.5 NTUs. But the reduction in forest cover, the equivalent of 1% reduction in forest cover results in an 18% decrease in turbidity. And the same thing a parallel applies for TOC, that shows that you can have a 16% decrease in TOC with that same 1% decrease in forest cover. So overall, watersheds with 50% of forested cover have a 1% increase that is associated with a 2% decrease in chemical treatment costs. So there's a lot of, if we were to translate this into dollars and cents, there's a lot of value in us protecting our source water. And of course, it's important for us to have these sort of localized studies that are applicable to the Caribbean and to our own setting. And looking at how do we apply these figures to the payback period for this sort of source water protection investment, and looking at the net present value. So what is the value of this today that it's worth in the future? So it's important for us when we're looking at this business case is to look at the triple bottom line. What are the benefits, not just to the utility, but also to the community, to the customer and the environment? And I think this will augur well for the financing instruments that we use. So if we decide if there's an option for us to look at a sort of rate structure that will allow us to do source water protection, the case for source water protection affecting or impacting, benefiting the community and the customer and the environment and just the wider economy will be important here. So some of the key messages are just understanding the risk of contamination. So knowing your source water protection area and understanding what are the risks of contamination of that source water protection area. And that's really the starting point of any source water protection plan, knowing what can affect your source water, your rivers and your aquifers that you pull water from. Of course, prevention has a higher cost-benefit ratio than cleaning up or abandoning a source of water. And that could be sometimes a ratio between 5 to 1 and 2, or even as high as 200 to 1. Utility water source water protection planning should be coupled with bottom-up approaches. So it's not just how this is benefiting the utility, it's how it's benefiting the entire country and the environment. And then stakeholder management and engagement is key to planning and executing a source water protection plan. Utilities cannot do it all, and they need the help of stakeholders, particularly the community and other actors within their source water protection area that can work with the different stakeholders and sectors to help protect our sources of water. And then source water protection and water safety planning. And source water protection is part of that wider sort of strategy of water safety planning that brings the catchment, or the relationship between the catchment and the consumer should really be a critical training focus for utilities. So it's not just how we treat water, but it's how it's looking outside of the pumping station. And then because of the limited land space that a lot of the Caribbean islands have, everything we do on that limited land space can affect our water supply. So there's even a greater impetus or push or thrust for us to really focus on source water protection. So the key is to know your watershed, know your catchment area, and know your community. And that is how we can move forward to protecting source water. So that's it for me. I guess we have questions now, right?
Yes, sure. Thank you so much, Sara Jade. That was an excellent presentation. I trust that the participants here would have questions for you. Please go ahead. Anyone? Yes, somebody has some comments. I think, Nicole, you can go ahead. You can unmute and go ahead with your comments.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Hi, yes. Hi, Sara Jade. It was a very good presentation. I especially enjoyed listening about the business case for source water protection. And one of the two comments I have are about the examples you would have used at the very beginning, where you would have said in the example of groundwater, not groundwater, source water protection, you would have used examples from like the US with EPA. However, Barbados has been doing it since the 1960s through their groundwater protection policy. And because of that, when it came to the second example you used of contamination, and you spoke about our sewer plants. So that time that we had the sewage spill, because we had that in place since the 1960s, when the first sewage plant was designed for in 1970s, the sewer network as well as the sewage treatment plant was not placed in a zone 1 where it could impact on the source. It was both that plant as well as the South Coast plant where the sewer spills were happening. Both the network as well as the plant were not placed where they would have affected any of our aquifers, because they were placed in zone 5, where our zone 1 is at that close travel time to the aquifers. So those were placed in zone 5. So because of that source protection that we had from since the 1960s, when these plants came into operation after the 1970s, that's it. So really and truly, the sewer spill can be used as an example of prevention better than cure, because we would have placed those plants in those areas and those zones, and therefore when any failure in the sewer network occurred, you didn't have to abandon any aquifers. You didn't have to abandon getting, because all of our water in Barbados comes from groundwater. So that was just the comments that I wanted to say. Enjoyed your business case for source water protection slides, and then those two examples that you would have used. Right.
Thank you, Nicole. And I think the Barbados case, as you mentioned, will be an important, I think, case study for us to share among our regional counterparts, because you're not just showing the success, but you're also showing when you start early, as you said, from the 1960s, before sewage treatment plants were built, that sort of development planning filtered through to protect your resources. So I think thank you for that intervention.
I see that we have Derek Jones as his hand up, and I think there's somebody else in the chat when you're through with him. Go ahead, Derek.
Hi, Ignatius. Good evening, and I must say to Ms. Govia, it was an excellent presentation. Source water protection, and as she started, I thought about a plant we have here in Trinidad, which is the Cwwa water treatment plant. And I am looking at the present situation, really COVID-19. What has happened in this period is that they have restricted the recreational and religious use of upstream of that plant. Now that plant have been plagued with agricultural, recreational, and religious activities impacting on the quality of the raw water. And my question to Ms. Govia, how could we, now that we have these restrictions in place presently, how could we continue to, how could we keep that those restrictions in place? Who do we talk to? Who do we write the letters to? Where do we lobby?
Yeah, and I think Cwwa is a great example, because Cwwa actually has a very active community group. And in my water resources time, I remember that it was sort of one of the first I guess, developments of or push from the community for source water protection. So one of the interventions that the community wanted actually was for WASA the utility to purchase that land that is the recreational space, and be able to limit the activities, whether it be religious or recreational, at that site. The challenge with doing that was the other stakeholders at the governmental level that I guess it's very sensitive, you know, using water for especially religious purposes is a very sensitive politically and socially issue. And I know that the community was lobbying a lot for the organizations like the Forestry Division and some of the other land use regulators to do something about it. I think in terms of what the solution should be, is what the community sort of settled on is having some sort of public education outreach that will allow the users of CORA, the recreational users, to use the site but not pollute or contaminate. But I think it's definitely a case that if we can solve and untangle, it would be a good success story of how we protect source water using the community champions to benefit municipal utility planning. But I know the CORA case very well.
Yeah, so we have a question. I think we have a comment here from Everest. You want to go ahead, Everest? Or would you? I think you can go ahead. Everest? Okay, I think his comment is, he says you would like to speak on the importance of the multi-barrier approach in the integrated management of source water.
Okay. So I think, let me just go back to share my screen. So when I think I'm struggling a little bit, Everest, with your comment. But just going back to this whole concept of integrated water resources management, it's really looking at how stakeholders can come together to work together at the community level and at the governmental level and corporate to solve this problem of water resources management. What we've recognized is that there are many players and many activities that affect water resources. And the only way for us to effectively manage water resources is by doing it in a coordinated way. Not just having one institution regulate water resources, but having a committee or a working group or a task force of institutions that can come together and perform that regulation. And the role of the utility, of course, is very important. I know that in a lot of cases, especially in the region, the utility sort of has a lead role for integrated water resources management. And I think that because of the evolution of this concept of IWRM, what is being recognized is that the utility is one of the players, but of course they cannot regulate water resources on their own. So I don't know if that, if you want to jump in and just clarify a little bit, clarify your question a little bit, if you can. If not, I hope that answers it.
In Barbados, we find that although we are the major regulators, we have a tripartite relationship. Our regulations for source water protection is by the Town Country Planning Office. You can't build without their permission. Also, the Environmental Protection Department which is a section of the Ministry of Environment, also monitors us. And then the other part is the monitoring and the inspection. The Ministry of Health, the environmental health officers also monitor our supply and our distribution. So therefore you have the protection by the Zone Water Protection Policy being enforced by Town Planning, Barbados Water Authority, and the EPD, although it would seem a conflict that the utility is helping to regulate, and they depend heavily on our word. And you are monitored also by the Ministry of Health. So you have the treatment for protection, the monitoring for protection, and the control and the prevention from upfront.
So Alex, if I may ask, what is the instrument that is used to coordinate with the different agencies that do enforcement? Is it something as basic as a MOU, or do they meet? How do you?
This is the groundwater protection policy, and if you're doing development, you apply to the town country planning, right? And they would send to us. Right now, we have presently an integrated e-planning system. So as soon as you make an application to the town country planning department, it will show up flagging us at Barbados Water Authority, wherever you are in the island. Now, when it comes to Zone 1, then we'll do those more thorough investigations. Because if you had previously occupied that land, the policy was instituted in 1963 after a study called the Telstra study that was funded by the British Geological Survey. And so they developed the five zone area, which we are in the process of reviewing right now. And if you had previously existed, you had a kind of grandfathering, then you were allowed to improve, because the level of housing or class of housing in 1963 would be totally different to the level of housing now. So basically, you have an application, you couldn't then do change a single family dwelling to a multi-family dwelling. There are limits on your waste must be into a septic tank, through a activated carbon filter bed, and not greater than 10 feet or so in depth, 10 to 12 feet in depth. So therefore you limit the depth of your wells. You do a septic tank and you do polishing through a filter bed. And these things are also monitored and enforced by the Environmental Protection Department and the Ministry of Health. So it's a tripartite or so control outside the water authority, plus the water authority that have the right to deny you water for development in those areas.
Right. Definitely sounds like the Barbados case is quite impressive and something we can all learn from. And I know that you have an important reason for doing that because of your geology. So anything that happens on land directly affects your aquifers.
Sarah, just a question here. Are there in some of what utilities do you know would have IWRM units within them? Just a question. And then after that, I think we have Jason Ernest of the WRMA in St. Lucia has his hand up.
Yeah, I think a lot of the utilities practice integrated water resources management, or they support integrated water resources management. As to whether they call it an IWRM unit, I think that's something that most utilities or most water resources regulators are coming around to. But I mean, as the case in Barbados showed, it really is to have an integrated water resources management unit within a water utility is in itself a conflict, because the water utility is also a user of water. So the best practice, of course, dictates that the for integrated water resources management to be effective, that the regulator must be separate and apart from the source provider, who must be separate and apart from the policymaker. So I think a lot of utilities are coming around, and countries are coming around to that sort of best practice.
Okay, Jason, go ahead.
Hello, good afternoon. Jason Ernest, Water Resources Management Agency here in St. Lucia. In St. Lucia, our water supply comes primarily from surface water. And in the areas that we consider to be gathering grounds are primarily made up of national and private forests. So it's, in some cases, it's always a challenge in terms of trying to prevent certain activities from happening upstream of our intakes. So because of the size of the agency, we more or less primarily concentrate on what's happening upstream so that there is no pollution to the supply that's entering the intakes that the utility uses. So in terms of looking at the private forests, the private lands, and the activities that are taking place, it's more or less a matter of trying to gentle persuasion in terms of what is happening. Because if we declare those areas to be protected, or water control areas, or waste control areas, based on the legislation, compensation has to be given to those landowners. And we know that it would be a very costly venture for any government. Currently, right now, we actually have a case where the utility, there is this major project that the utility did in one of the catchments, and they built a new water intake. Now there's a farmer who's upstream of that intake, and well, everybody saw that activities were happening. Some persons got compensated because they had to run the raw water lines on their land or cut the roots so that crops were destroyed so that the employees of the utility can access the intake. So he wasn't compensated, and he realized other persons were compensated. So then what he did, he approached the institution stating that he wants to develop a pig farm on his property. And he knows very well that is going to affect the water resources. So then he more or less contacted the Ministry of Agriculture, and he said he needs assistance. How can you assist him in terms of developing the pig farm? What does he have to put in place? You know, so investigation was done and realized that definitely if that takes place, he would be polluting the water from day one. And he knows that. He said, yeah, I know if I put it, it's gonna affect the water resource. So then basically what it is that you can do for me. So we're in the process of now trying to see whether we can do a land swap, because we know that it's in terms of him getting monetary compensation, it may take a very long time, or the government may not be in a position to pay him at a time that it deems reasonable. Now the thing is, he's just one landowner in that area, and there are multiple parcels. So even if there is a positive outcome from his case, there are still many others that can basically come up with the same idea, seeing that probably some form of compensation is given. So we're basically still at zero in terms of doing that. So what it is in terms of the legislation, in terms of how it's looked at, how the lands are being used, where you consider to be the headwaters, the source waters. It's a case that it may not, based on the current laws, it may not always be I'd say it may not be in a position where it would allow for the adequate protection of the resource, because persons are starting to encroach higher and higher up into the forested lands, And in terms of the whole integrated water resources management, looking to see how, now you can create livelihood from those lands so that persons don't go outright into open agriculture. So how they can use the forest to create some sort of livelihood. You also have to fight against persons now wanting to do developments, probably some ecotourism, build eco-lodges right in the forested areas that that are sources of the raw water that persons need for all type of activity. So in terms of the enforcement, if we don't have like a serious land use policy, which I say sometimes might have to be a little draconian as to what persons know that they can do in certain areas, then we would always be having those conflicts with landowners who see first and foremost that this is the land that they have, they don't have anything else, so they basically want to make a livelihood out of it, and putting limitations on them as to what they cannot do. Economically, it may not be beneficial to them. So how do you approach that, especially knowing that the governments are cash strapped in terms of giving adequate, in terms of giving out compensation, and by legislation, that's what it says. If you declare an area to be protected or gathering ground for water, compensation has to be given to the landowner, and a lot of our forested areas are in private hands. So from the agency's standpoint here, this is some of the these are some of the cases that we're consistently trying, to see how we can resolve those situations so that it doesn't really affect the quality of our waters, basically at the headwaters, because if those get affected, then basically the entire system would be affected. So it's a challenge, and hopefully sometime down the line, maybe the legislation might actually be such that those areas actually become protected, and it's a win-win situation for both the institutions and both the private individuals. Yeah, thank you.
Right, thank you, Jason.
Jason, I think you raised an important point about how effective or how limited sometimes legislation can be, which is why one of the source water protection management measures is to work with the stakeholders. So working with these landowners to find ways that can control their risk of contamination of sites. And I think there's a lot of opportunity here, particularly in the region, to use green infrastructure to buffer some of those effects and those risks. So as you mentioned, the whole issue of the pig farm. So it's finding that sort of the best land use development plan for that farmer. And it's not just the responsibility of the utility, right? You have to bring in the agricultural extension officers and the Ministry of Agriculture to find a system that you can compromise, so the farmer can still farm. I'm not sure if a pig farm will be best, but he can still have his farm. But at the same time, the system that he sets up, the development that he installs or implements does not compromise the source water,
yes,
the facility. Yeah.
Yeah, so just taking that same case with the farmer, where we actually had a disciplinary team, which involved the Water Resources Management Agency, Environmental Health, Forestry Department, Extension Services, and also the Planning Department. So I mean, different options were laid out there, but probably he wouldn't want to go into tree crops because that might take a longer period of time. You probably wouldn't want to do any type of farming because maybe the rate of return might be different if he goes into the pig farm. And even we're looking at what probably some of the technologies that he could use for that. But what we've noticed that in other areas it has not really worked out. So it's almost as if, like, you probably get promises that yes, okay, we will implement A, B, and C, and then you give the okay, and then when production starts, it's a totally different scenario. So it's almost nipping it at the bud that certain activities definitely cannot and will not take place. Now, if he says that this is what he wants to do and he's been challenged, then again, probably does he have can he take legal recourse? You understand? Because now you're looking at the legislation. What does the legislation say? So even if I say that, and probably not backed up by certain legislation, then is there a case? So that's why I say, so sometimes, it's you have to weigh the situation and see exactly what's at your disposal, what you can use, speak to the farmer, and then see, okay, what might be the best outcome for a compromise that both parties are comfortable with.
Okay, I think Alex has his hand raised. He wants to make an intervention. Go ahead, Alex.
Right, hi. Yeah, in the case, there's St. Lucia. The first thing, there might be a working example coming out of the Jeff IWCAM study that Vincent had led some years ago, where they addressed the same problem with the pig farmers. Because what I'm hearing just now is the first thing that was left out was the actual farmers and finding a way to get them involved. But Brazil, for example, there has a good example, and it's in their water law on how to compensate farmers, how much you would, is set out specifically how much you would pay the farmer, and is enforced by legislation. Well, look, if you were impacting X amount of water and you was doing such and such an activity, what what type of compensation or what type of help you would get, so that therefore is something that's set out and you'll be able to follow along that. But to look at the Brazil example, the Institute of Water in Brazil, there are some good examples where they go through their laws and so forth. So that would be a good example to look at the Brazil laws on how you compensate people for the disadvantage that they incur when you use when your protection of water impact them.
Okay, thank you. Any other observations, questions for Sarah? Anyone else?
Yeah, just can I ask a question? Since we're talking about integrated water resources management, in terms of a country, probably in the region, that can be cited as a best practice, probably doesn't have to be perfect or ideal, but one that the other countries can look at in terms of how that machinery works, in terms of all the stakeholders coming together, and probably the experiences that they had to go through, and now it's actually working for them. Is there any country that we can cite? Because I know that we've been talking about integrated water resources management for a while, and I think that's what we're all working towards, because as a regulatory agency, we work with all our stakeholders, because like we say, the water comes from the land. So it's not only when it arrives in the river that you basically have to take note of it. You have to take note of it before that, and then each institution is responsible for a piece in that jigsaw. So in terms of a country that can be cited as, yeah, that has moved ahead of the rest, is there a case that, Sarah, you can probably highlight on? I'm not too sure.
Well, I mean, it seems as though Barbados is doing a good job at that coordination. So it'd probably be good for you to connect with either Alex or Nicole. Yeah. But what I can give you is the Trinidad and Tobago case, which is not the integrated water resources management at the national level, but it's an execution mechanism for integrated water resources management, and that is the Adopter River program. And what that is meaning to do is bring communities and corporate, I guess, corporate citizens to support the management of water resources. And that is done through, is managed through an oversight committee that comprises of different governmental stakeholders. And the success story really has been in one particular catchment area that we call Gunapo, which has a number of development challenges. And the major, the most striking one is landfill that has not been treating its leachate. So the leachate, I guess, just flows into the river from the leachate pond, and farmers use that leachate to service, I guess, water their plants. And because of the intervention of the Adopter River program and some other stakeholders, including the university and tertiary institutions, they have been able to even set up a community group that now sort of monitors and champions the regulation and the surveillance that happens within their watershed and within their community. So I think that is a sort of best practice example of how to effect IWRM at the community level. But I think it would be good for Barbados for you to connect with Barbados on how they actually do that institutional coordination, because that has always been the difficult part. What I would say though is that I think a lot of the Latin American countries are doing a good job in terms of how they effect IWRM. It's just we have, unfortunately, because of our language barrier, have never been able to really monopolize on that opportunity to learn from how they manage water at the integrated level.
Yeah, sure. I recall at the World Water Forum in Brazil a couple of years ago. I attended some of the local government and municipal and sessions, and there were lots of these examples of how the municipalities worked with the communities in managing the water resource and for water source protection. Yeah. So I think perhaps at some time in the future we can elaborate a session, Sarah, albeit maybe perhaps with CWWA, and we can broaden the whole scope of this. I think Alex and Nicole have made some brilliant interventions and to support your presentation. So we have gone way past time. So I'd like to thank you very much, Sarah, for giving us your time this afternoon. And I'd like everyone to know that CWWA, I think you can take a plug here to mention the CWWA virtual conference that's going to take place, please.
Yeah, thank you, Ignatius. And Ignatius is actually on our executive council as well. We were supposed to be physically in St. Lucia in October of this year. But of course, because of COVID, we're now doing everything virtual. And I think it's an exciting opportunity. So a virtual conference is from the 19th to the 23rd of October. Let me just make sure I got those. Yes, that's right. So we have a very exciting program of technical sessions. And I think what gives the CWWA conference the edge is the Caribbean element. So you're going to hear examples of your counterparts in other Caribbean countries, of what they are doing in different areas, not just water and wastewater, but also we have a strong focus on waste, solid waste, and I think it'll be exciting because we now have the opportunity to connect with a wider audience. So we're no longer restricted by being able to travel easily to the venue. We're now virtual. So it will be a sort of groundbreaking experience for CWWA that we're very excited about. So I hope that you can join us, and go check our website at cwwa.net for more information on how you can join us for this virtual conference.
Right. Thank you very much, Sarah. And we want to thank all our participants for joining us this afternoon. As usual, we are recording the proceedings and we will be circulating them to all of you who participated, as well as posting them on our Facebook page and our website. Next week, September 9th, we'll get back to the Wednesday session. This time it's going to be on managing anxiety and depression. And this is a presentation going to be done by Sherry Barron, an HR consultant. She's actually going to do a session tomorrow for our HR consultants. But we believe our operators are going through lots of anxieties and so on, particularly during this COVID period. So we want to be able to share some of that, and that will be done next Wednesday from 4 to 5 p.m. We're going to send the notices out, and please do register. And we wish you all safe journey home and have a good weekend. Thank you again, Sarah.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay.